Declan Ashworth's finger was an inch from Sawyer Kincaid's face, and the whole block had stopped to watch. "You're a joke," he said, loud enough for the revolving doors behind him to catch it, loud enough for the woman beside him to laugh. Margot Faircloth's laughter rose with the others. Careless, easy, gone before she could catch it back. Sawyer said nothing. His hand stayed still on the tongs, the grill hissing under him. The single dad was humiliated for selling food on the street. No one knew he owned the company. He looked down at the grill and did not look up again. 6:30 in the morning, the apartment still dark except for the stove light, and Sawyer Kincaid was already awake, already moving. He cracked 2 eggs into a pan, listened for the small thunder of 9-year-old feet down the hallway, and had a plate on the table before Marlo even asked for one. She climbed onto her chair, hair still tangled from sleep, and studied him with the particular seriousness only children manage before 8 in the morning. "You have to tie my shoe," she said. "You always forget." "I never forget." He crouched anyway, looped the laces into a bow that would not survive first recess, and let her correct him twice before she was satisfied. Big day. Talent show sign-ups. "I'm not doing the talent show." She said it the way she said most things lately, flat and final, though her eyes gave her away, flicking toward the flyer taped to the refrigerator. "Maybe. I don't know. You'll know by Friday." He kissed the top of her head, grabbed her backpack, and they were out the door before the coffee finished brewing, the cart already loaded in the back of the old Chevy, waiting for its corner. He dropped her at school with the same 3 words he always used. Quick hug, quiet joke. "See you at 4. And drove the 10 minutes into uptown Charlotte with the windows down, letting the city wake up around him. He parked the cart where his father had parked it 30 years earlier, in the shadow of a glass tower that hadn't existed then, on a strip of sidewalk that had somehow survived 3 decades of rezoning and 2 decades of construction. Ashford Meridian Capital rose 40 stories above him, its name etched in brushed steel over the entrance, and Sawyer set up his umbrella without looking at it, the way a man doesn't look twice at his own reflection. By 7, the smell of onions and grilling meat drifted toward the plaza, and by 7:15, the first suits of the morning were lining up analysts, junior associates, a security guard who always ordered the same thing and never paid full price because Sawyer never let him. Margot Faircloth came at 7:30, as she did most mornings. Not for him, but for the coffee cart 2 stalls down. Though she'd started nodding at Sawyer on her way past, a small habit neither of them had named. "Morning," she said, cup already in hand. "Morning." He didn't look up from the grill. "Big case today?" "Every day's a big case." She smiled. The kind of smile people give strangers they've decided they don't mind seeing again, and kept walking toward the revolving doors, heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm he'd learned without meaning to. Neither of them asked what the other did beyond the obvious. She assumed a food cart. He assumed a law firm somewhere in the tower, one office among 400. It was easier that way, and neither had a reason to make it harder. The corner had its own small economy of regulars by then. People who orbited the cart the way people orbit any good habit. An elderly man who came for the crossword and stayed for the company. 2 interns who split a hot dog between them because their stipend didn't stretch further. A florist from the shop across the street who traded Sawyer daisies for lunch on slow Fridays. None of them knew his last name either. It had never once seemed to matter. The peace didn't last past 8. Declan Ashworth came through the doors at 8:15 sharp, phone against his ear, suit pressed to a point that looked uncomfortable, and slowed just enough to wrinkle his nose as he passed the cart. "Smells like a state fair out here," he said to no one and everyone, loud enough to be heard, not quite loud enough to be confronted. He didn't wait for a response. He never did. He kept walking, already dialing the next call, already forgetting the man behind the grill existed for now. Sawyer watched him go, jaw tight, and flipped the next batch of hot dogs without a word. Some mornings you let it go. He told himself this one was no different. Otis Renfrew came by that evening the way he always did unannounced, a leather folder under one arm, 2 beers already sweating in a paper bag. He let himself into Sawyer's apartment with the spare key he'd had for 11 years and found Sawyer at the kitchen table, going through Marlowe's homework folder with the concentration of a man avoiding something else. "Quarterly signatures," Otis said, dropping the folder on the table. "Trust documents. You could read them this time, instead of just signing where I flag it. I trust you." Sawyer signed without opening it past the tab. "That's the whole point of the arrangement." Otis sat, cracked a beer, and watched his friend for a long moment before he spoke again. You know they're calling it a chairman's report now, not a founder's report. Not even a majority owner's report. Chairman. Like you're a name on a letterhead. I am a name on a letterhead. You're the reason there's a letterhead. Otis leaned forward. 51% Sawyer, Kincaid Family Trust. You built Ashford Meridian out of a card table and a phone line. And there's not a soul under that roof who could tell you what you look like, because you made sure of it. Declan Ashworth walks past you every morning and doesn't know he's walking past his own boss. Sawyer closed the folder. That was the deal. I stepped back. The board gets a professional CEO. I get to disappear. And the company doesn't get dragged through what happened to Elena a second time. The board didn't offer you a deal. They used your grief because it was convenient, right after the funeral, right when you couldn't fight back, and dressed it up as compassion. Otis's voice softened. I've gone along with it because you asked me to. But something's shifting. Ashworth's been meeting with outside investors, quietly, rounding up proxy votes from the smaller shareholders, the ones who don't read the fine print. If he gets enough of them behind a merger proposal, your 51% stops mattering, because there won't be a controlling stake left to matter over. Sawyer sat back, the weight of it settling slow. He's trying to sell the company out from under itself. He's trying to sell it out from under you specifically. Whether he knows that's what he's doing is another question. Otis studied him. You need to pay attention at least. You don't have to come back. Just pay attention. Sawyer stood, walked to the window, looked out at the tower lit gold against the dark, 40 floors of a life he'd built, and then folded away like a shirt he didn't want to wear anymore. I don't want to go back in there, Otis. I have a kid who needs breakfast made and shoes tied. I have a corner where nobody looks at me like I'm supposed to be something. I don't want it back. I know. Otis finished his beer. I'm just telling you it might not ask permission before it comes looking for you. Across town, on the 31st floor, Margot Faircloth sat alone in her office long after the lights in the rest of the floor had gone dim, an email open on her screen that she'd read 4 times without absorbing. Subject line, Leadership Continuity Review, second phase. No names attached to the concerns listed. No specifics. Just a vague, itemized list of governance considerations that read like someone building a case without saying who the case was against. She thought of Declan's voice in the hallway that afternoon, low and urgent on a call he'd ended the moment he saw her. She didn't know what it meant yet. She only knew it left a taste she didn't like, and she closed her laptop without answering it, the unease following her out to the elevator anyway. By morning, Declan had moved from words to action. He stood at the edge of the plaza with a building security officer at his elbow, gesturing at the cart, at the umbrella, at the small folding chair where Marlo sometimes did her homework after school. This corner is prime frontage for the building, Declan was saying. Not to Sawyer, but about him, the way people talk about furniture. It's an eyesore. Clients see this before they see our lobby. I want it handled. The officer, a broad man named Curtis who bought a chili dog every Tuesday without fail, looked uncomfortable. He's got a vendor permit, Mr. Ashworth. City issued. Nothing I can do about that. Then find something you can do. Declan didn't wait for an answer, checking his watch instead, already halfway back to the doors. Margot had stopped 10 feet away, coffee in hand, closer to the scene than she meant to be. She watched Curtis walk off looking apologetic, watched Sawyer keep working the grill like none of it had happened, jaw set in a way she was starting to recognize. She didn't say anything. She told herself it wasn't her fight, that Declan ran his department however he wanted, that it was none of her business how he treated a man selling hot dogs on a sidewalk. The excuse didn't sit right, and she carried the discomfort with her into the lobby without knowing what to do with it. Marlo showed up at 3:45 that afternoon, backpack heavier than she was, and dropped into the folding chair beside the cart with the particular exhaustion of a 9-year-old who'd had a full day of feelings. She pulled out a sketchbook and got to work on something involving a dragon and, inexplicably, a school bus, tongue between her teeth in concentration. "Good day?" Sawyer asked, sliding a napkin under her elbow before she could get mustard on the page. "Fine." A pause, pencil still moving. Miss Alvarez asked again about the talent show. "And?" I said maybe. She looked up. "You'd come, right? If I did it? I'd come if you sang the school fight song backwards. Wouldn't miss it." She smiled. The real one. The one that made the whole day worth it. And went back to her dragon. Margot appeared a few minutes later, cup in hand as always, but she lingered this time instead of moving straight through. "That the artist?" she asked, nodding at Marlowe. Best one on the block. Sawyer handed over the coffee. Marlowe, say hi. Hi, Marlowe said, already back in the sketchbook. Margot laughed. Easy and real. And for a moment the three of them existed in a small pocket of ordinary a man. His daughter, a woman who bought her coffee 2 stalls down and had started, without deciding to, caring whether the man behind the cart was having a decent day. She asked about Marlowe's grade, her school, whether the dragon had a name. She didn't ask what Sawyer did before this corner, and he didn't ask what floor she worked on. It wasn't avoidance. It simply never came up, the way it doesn't come up between two people whose only history together is a cart, a corner, and a habit of showing up. That evening, a message went out to the Neighborhood Association's private board, unsigned, professionally worded, citing sanitation concerns and pedestrian flow. It requested a review of unlicensed commercial activity on the plaza frontage. Sawyer's cart was licensed, thoroughly. But the association didn't know that yet, and by the time anyone checked, the complaint would already be doing its work. Curtis found Sawyer that same evening, folding the cart's awning down for the night, and lingered a moment longer than usual. Man upstairs is building a file on you, he said quietly. Don't know why. Don't much like it either. Thought you should hear it from somebody instead of a letter. Appreciate it, Curtis. Just watch yourself. He tapped the counter twice, the closest thing to a handshake either of them ever needed, and went back to his post, leaving Sawyer alone with the tightening feeling that whatever this was, it had only just started. The boardroom on the 40th floor smelled like coffee and cold air conditioning, and Declan Ashworth stood at the head of the table, with a deck of slides that used words like optimization and brand alignment to describe removing a hot dog cart from a sidewalk. The plaza is the first thing every client sees, he said. It should reflect who we are, not who happened to set up there first. Margot sat halfway down the table, legal pad in front of her, and found herself reading the lease documents referenced in his footnotes more carefully than the topic seemed to warrant. Something in the language snagged an easement clause tied to the original ground lease, dated decades back, referencing a name she didn't recognize, and a set of terms that seemed to restrict what the building's owners could do with that exact strip of sidewalk. She flagged the page without knowing why it mattered yet. A lawyer's instinct, working faster than her understanding. I'd like more time on the plaza item, she said when Declan paused for questions. There's an easement reference in the original lease I want to run down before we authorize anything. Declan's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. It's a formality, Margot. I've already had it reviewed. Then you won't mind if I review it again. He held her gaze a second too long before he moved on, and she made a note in the margin of her pad, who reviewed this, and when. Across the plaza, unaware of any of it, Sawyer received a folded notice tucked under his cart's umbrella pole, a formal request, city letterhead borrowed in tone, if not in fact, giving him 7 days to vacate the corner, pending a zoning review triggered by a documented community complaint. He read it twice, then a third time, and felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with the cart itself and everything to do with what it represented: his father's spot, held for 30 years, threatened by a man who didn't know he was threatening the person who could end his career with a signature. Otis came by that night without the beer, all business. You've got a 7-day letter, he said. I heard. It's not really about the sidewalk, Sawyer. It's a pressure tactic. He's testing what you'll do when something you actually care about gets touched. If you fold quietly, he learns the trust has no teeth behind it. If you fight, he learns who's really holding 51%. So either way, he learns something. Either way, he learns something. Otis leaned against the counter. You could end this with one phone call, one appearance. You still have proxy rights nobody's touched in 3 years. Sawyer folded the notice and set it on the table, next to Marlowe's dragon drawing, next to the quarterly trust folder he still hadn't fully read. 2 lives sat on that table, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't sure they could stay separate much longer. Give me a few days, he said. Just a few. You don't have 7, Sawyer. You might not even have that. Otis gathered his things to leave, then paused at the door, folder tucked back under his arm. For what it's worth, your father held that corner through 2 recessions and a hurricane. He never once needed a title to do it. Maybe you don't either, but you might need to remind them you're still standing on it. Sawyer didn't answer right away, and Otis let the door close softly behind him, leaving the notice and the drawing side by side on the table long after the apartment had gone quiet. Rain came down hard over Uptown that Thursday evening, the kind that turned gutters into small rivers and sent everyone running for cover, except the man who couldn't afford to leave his cart unattended. Sawyer wrestled with the tarp, one hand losing the fight against the wind, when a second pair of hands appeared out of nowhere, steadying the far corner. "You're going to lose that whole setup if you don't tie it off first," Margot said, hair already plastered to her forehead, heels sacrificed to a puddle she hadn't noticed in time. "You don't have to do this." "I know." She grabbed the rope anyway, looping it the way she'd learned camping as a kid, and between the two of them the tarp held. They ended up under the small awning together, Rain hammering 3 feet away, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough that it didn't feel strange. "You didn't have to stop," he said again, quieter this time. "I know that too." She wrung water out of her sleeve. "I don't really know why I did." They talked for almost an hour, the rain giving them permission to stay still in a way the rest of their lives rarely did. She told him about growing up the daughter of 2 lawyers who never once asked what she wanted, only what she'd chosen. He told her, carefully, about raising a daughter alone, about the parts of the day that were easy and the parts that still caught him sideways at bedtime, when the apartment got quiet enough to remember who used to fill it. Then, without deciding to, she said it. "That morning, when Ashworth was going off on you in the plaza," she looked down at her hands. "I laughed. I don't even know why. It was reflex, I think. Or cowardice. Or both. I've been sick about it for weeks and I never said anything." He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain instead of her. "You came back," he said finally. "Most people who laugh don't come back. They just keep walking. That's not really forgiveness. No. But it's a start." He handed her a napkin for her face, which made her laugh, a real laugh this time, nothing careless in it. "I'm not interested in keeping score, Margot. People do things in crowds they wouldn't do standing alone. You're standing alone right now." She looked at him for a long moment, something settling between them that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Not romance yet, not even close, but the particular trust that grows when someone hands you back your own worst moment without using it against you. The rain let up a little after 9. She helped him finish securing the cart, and they walked in opposite directions without much of a goodbye, just a nod, an unspoken agreement to see each other on the corner tomorrow. Neither of them asked what the other did for a living. It still hadn't come up, and for reasons neither could name, it felt like it wasn't supposed to yet. 2 floors below Margot's office, in a records room that smelled like toner and old paper, a young paralegal named Priya Osei was hunting for an unrelated file when she pulled a folder mislabeled 3 years earlier by someone who no longer worked there. The tab read Kincaid Family Trust Ground Lease, 1998. She flipped it open out of nothing more than curiosity, glanced at a name that meant nothing to her yet, and set it aside on a cart of files to be reshelved, unaware she'd just found the loose thread that would unravel the whole building. Margot found Priya's mislabeled folder 3 days later, called down to records chasing the easement question that had been gnawing at her since the board meeting, and asked for anything filed under the original construction lease. Priya, remembering the odd folder from the reshelving cart, brought it up without thinking twice. "This was misfiled," Priya said, setting it on Margot's desk. "Found it under a different case number entirely. Figured you'd want the original instead of the summary version everyone's been citing." Margot opened it and went still. The ground lease, dated more than 2 decades back, transferred the plaza parcel, the exact strip of sidewalk Declan wanted, cleared from a family trust to the entity that would later become Ashford Meridian Capital. The transfer carried a permanent easement clause. The original family retained perpetual right of access to a defined section of that frontage, non-transferable, non-revocable, without the signature of the trust's controlling party. And at the bottom, in a hand she now recognized without wanting to, the signature read, S. Kincaid, founder, sole controlling shareholder. She read it 3 times before the pieces found each other. Kincaid, the man behind the cart, the one who'd stood in the rain with her 3 nights earlier, apologized for a laugh instead of a lawsuit. She pulled up the trust registry attached to the company's own governance filings, a document she had access to, and had simply never had reason to open, and found the ownership breakdown she should have known for years. 51%. Kincaid Family Trust. Controlling interest. Uncontested since founding. The man selling hot dogs on the sidewalk in front of the building owned the building's parent company outright. She sat with that for a long time before she moved to the second question, the one that mattered more. Why hadn't this lease appeared anywhere in Declan's plaza proposal? She pulled the file history and found her answer fast. The easement reference had been in an earlier draft of his presentation and was cut before the final version reached the board, the deletion logged under Declan's own account 3 days before the meeting. He hadn't missed it. He'd removed it, deliberately, so the board would authorize clearing a corner he had no legal right to touch, evicting a man he had no idea he was actually working for. Margot walked to her window that overlooked the plaza and found Sawyer exactly where he always was, closing up the cart for the evening, wiping down the grill with the same care he gave everything. She watched him for a long moment, seeing him differently now, not the man who made her coffee neighbor's mornings easier, but the reason the building she worked in existed at all, and the man Declan Ashworth had spent 2 weeks trying to humiliate off his own property. She didn't call down to him. Not yet. She went back to her desk and started building the file that would end this the right way. She worked past midnight, cross-referencing every version of Declan's presentation against the metadata, printing timestamps, building a timeline no one on the board would be able to argue with. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, she caught herself thinking not about the case, but about the rain 3 nights earlier, about a man who'd forgiven a laugh without asking for anything in return, and how much that forgiveness was about to cost him if she didn't get every fact exactly right. The emergency board session convened on a Tuesday morning, called by Margot herself under governance protocols few people remembered existed, and the room filled slowly with directors who assumed it was about quarterly numbers until she began speaking. She laid out the timeline without embellishment. The original lease, the easement clause, the deliberate deletion from Declan's presentation, the 7-day eviction notice issued against a plaza tenant who, as it happened, held permanent legal right to that ground. This board authorized action against a party we had no legal standing to remove, she said, based on a presentation with material information deliberately withheld by the person who prepared it. Declan stood too fast, chair scraping. This is absurd. I streamlined the deck for clarity. I didn't withhold anything material. The deletion is logged under your account, time-stamped 3 days before this board approved the Plaza initiative. Margot didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'd also like the board to know the identity of the lease's controlling party. He's not a stranger to this company. The door opened before she finished the sentence. Otis walked in first, and behind him, in the same gray sweater he wore to close up the cart every evening, came Sawyer Kincaid, 3 years absent from that room, recognized by exactly no one at the table, except the man now backing toward the window with the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. For those who don't know me, Sawyer said, voice even, I founded this company. I hold 51% through the Kincaid Family Trust, uncontested, unchanged, the whole time I've been gone, and as of this morning, I'm exercising controlling shareholder authority to block the merger proposal currently working its way through this board, a proposal built, in part, on proxy votes gathered under false pretenses about the company's leadership stability. The room did not move for a full 3 seconds. Declan opened his mouth and found nothing worth saying come out of it. I'd also like to note, Sawyer continued, that the man you were about to authorize evicting from a public sidewalk is the same man whose family lease your headquarters sits on. He has a name. It's mine. The vote came fast after that, procedural and merciless 9, in favor of removing Declan Ashworth from his position, effective immediately. 1 abstention, no support left for him in the room. Someone called security before the meeting had even fully adjourned. Declan was still talking as they walked him out, though nobody was listening anymore. Margot stood at the back of the room through all of it, papers still in hand. And when the noise settled, Sawyer's eyes found her first. Not the board, not the departing security detail, her a look that carried the whole weight of the last 2 weeks in it, gratitude and something else. Neither of them had a name for yet. Otis clapped a hand on Sawyer's shoulder once the room had mostly cleared, something close to pride breaking through his usual composure. 3 years, he said. 3 years I've been telling you it would find you eventually. You were right. Sawyer looked around the room that had once been his, at the empty chair still pushed back from where Declan had stood. I hate that you were right. I generally am. Otis allowed himself the smallest smile of the day. Go home, Sawyer. Tell your daughter you had a good day at work. For once you'll actually mean it. By evening, the story had already found its way to the local business press. though the framing was closer to guesswork than fact. A mysterious founder, a boardroom shakeup, a name nobody could quite confirm. Reporters called the tower's front desk. Nobody at the front desk knew what to tell them. Sawyer turned off his phone and drove to pick up Marlowe from school like it was any other Tuesday, because as far as he was concerned, it still needed to be. Otis fielded 3 separate calls from journalists before noon, each one more insistent than the last, and turned every one of them down flat on Sawyer's behalf. "He'll talk when he's ready," he told a reporter from the Business Journal, and today isn't that day. Before hanging up and turning his own phone face down on the desk, standing guard over a silence Sawyer hadn't asked for, but badly needed. "You're quiet," Marlowe said from the back seat, watching him in the rearview mirror the way she did when something felt off. "Just a long day at work. Good long or bad long?" He thought about it. "Good, I think. Still figuring it out." She seemed satisfied with that and went back to humming something from the radio, unaware that her father had just reclaimed a company worth more than she could imagine, more interested in whether he'd remembered to buy more of the good cereal. He kept the cart running for 2 more days, refusing every interview request that reached him, needing the ordinary rhythm of the corner a little longer before the rest of the world caught up with who he actually was. Marlowe noticed only that he laughed more, that he hummed while he flipped the grill, that something heavy she'd never fully understood seemed to have lifted off him without her needing to know why. Margot found him there on the second evening, not as counsel, not as anyone's employee, just a woman crossing the plaza in flat shoes because her feet couldn't take the heels 1 more hour. "I owe you an actual apology," she said, sitting on the low concrete edge near the cart. "Not the rain-soaked half version. The whole thing. I laughed at you in front of half the building, and I let 2 weeks go by before I did anything about the man who orchestrated it. I had access to that lease the entire time. I just never looked. You looked when it mattered." He wiped his hands on his apron and sat down beside her, closer to still than they'd ever been. "I've had people apologize for smaller things and mean it less." She glanced sideways at him. "Why the cart, Sawyer? You could have kept all this behind a desk somewhere. Invisible. Nobody the wiser. Why stand out here every morning where anyone could recognize you?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the evening traffic pull out of the plaza. "My wife died 3 years ago. Elena. It made the papers because I made the papers. And for months I couldn't walk into a grocery store without somebody's condolences turning into somebody's business card. The board used it as their excuse to push me out of the CEO seat, dressed it up as compassion, gave me a chairman title with no actual power, and I let them. Because fighting it meant staying visible, and I couldn't be visible anymore. My father used to run a cart on this exact corner. Coming back to it was the only thing that felt like mine." Margot didn't say anything right away. She let the silence hold what it needed to. "That's not hiding," she finally said. "That's rebuilding somewhere nobody's watching." Something like that. They sat there until the streetlights came on, not saying much else, the distance between them smaller than it had been even in the rain 3 nights before. When she finally stood to leave, she didn't rush it. And neither did he. 2 mornings later, the Charlotte Business Journal ran the confirmed story Sawyer Kincaid, founder of Ashford Meridian Capital, resuming an active leadership role after a 3-year absence, with one unusual condition attached to his return. The hot dog cart on the plaza frontage would remain exactly where it was, permanently, as what the press release awkwardly called a founding heritage installation. Readers found it charming. The board found it non-negotiable. Sawyer found it the only part of the announcement he'd actually written himself. The reinstatement ceremony was smaller than anyone expected, held not in a banquet hall but on the plaza itself, folding chairs set up around the cart like it was the guest of honor rather than the man standing beside it. Sawyer had insisted on the guest list personally. Curtis from building security in the front row, the cleaning crew who worked nights and had never once been invited to anything at Ashford Meridian, Otis beside him where he'd always belonged. "I built this company on this corner," Sawyer said, keeping the remark short because he'd never trusted long speeches. It seemed right to come back to it the same way. He unveiled a small brass plaque mounted near the cart, engraved simply with his father's name and the year he'd first set up shop, decades before any tower had risen to shade it. "Everything this company became started on this exact patch of concrete," he said, voice steadier than he expected it to be. "I think it's worth remembering that, especially on the days we're all standing 40 floors up and forget what the ground looked like." Marlowe helped him cut the ribbon, her small hand wrapped around his on the scissors, grinning at the applause like she'd personally engineered the whole event. It was the first time most of the company had seen her. The first time the two halves of Sawyer's life, the boardroom and the breakfast table, had ever occupied the same space in daylight. Margot stood near the front, not as counsel reading from a prepared statement, but simply present, the way a person stands when they've decided they intend to keep showing up. When the applause faded and the folding chairs began to empty, she found herself still there, and so did he. "Quite a first day back," she said. "Quite a 2 weeks, all around." He looked at her, then at the plaque, then at the tower rising gold behind them in the last of the daylight. "Thank you. For the lease. For not looking away twice. I told you. I don't really do things halfway once I've decided to." She smiled, and for once neither of them reached for a next thing to say, content to let the moment sit exactly as it was: a man, a woman, a cart, a tower, and a great deal of unspoken history settling quietly into place between them. 3 weeks in, the company had a full leadership calendar again, a rebuilt executive team, a merger proposal quietly withdrawn and never spoken of. And every Saturday morning, without fail, Sawyer Kincaid pushed the same cart out to the same corner, tied the same umbrella into place, and set up shop like a man with nothing at all to prove, because by then, he didn't. It wasn't necessity anymore. He could have paid someone else to run it, could have let the brass plaque stand alone as tribute enough. He came anyway, because the smell of onions on a griddle still felt more honest to him than most boardrooms ever had, and because some version of himself needed that corner the way other people needed a church or a long run before sunrise. Margot started showing up on Saturdays too, no longer the coffee cart regular who happened to nod on her way past, but someone who crossed the plaza specifically to sit on the low concrete edge and talk to him for an hour before either of them had anywhere else to be. She brought the newspaper sometimes. He brought a second cup of coffee he'd started keeping on hand without ever quite admitting why. Marlowe noticed before either adult said a word about it, the way children always do. One Saturday, sketchbook in her lap, she looked up at Margot mid-drawing and asked, with the devastating directness only a 9-year-old can manage, "Are you staying for breakfast? Or just coffee?" Margot blinked. Sawyer nearly dropped a bun onto the sidewalk. For a second, neither of them answered, caught between amusement and something neither wanted to name out loud in front of a fourth grader with a dragon drawing. "Depends what's on the menu," Margot finally said, recovering first, and Marlowe seemed to accept that as a reasonable answer, going back to her sketch without further comment. Entirely unaware, she'd just asked the only honest question either adult had been avoiding for weeks. Sawyer laughed. Really laughed. The kind that came from somewhere he hadn't used in a long time, and handed Margot a hot dog he'd made exactly the way she liked it. Mustard only, no ketchup, a preference he'd learned without meaning to, and never forgotten. Their hands brushed, passing the paper wrapper between them, brief and unremarkable to anyone watching, and neither of them pulled away first. Nothing was declared. No speech, no announcement, nothing that would have made sense against the ordinary hum of a Saturday morning on a plaza that had seen 30 years of hot dog carts and 3 months of something quietly becoming more than that. It was simply understood, in the way the important things between two careful people usually are not with words, but with the fact that she kept coming back, and he kept saving her the mustard. Marlowe went back to her dragon, humming to herself, entirely satisfied with an answer that promised nothing and somehow confirmed everything. The tower stood behind them the way it always had, 40 floors of glass catching the morning light, and for the first time in 3 years it looked to Sawyer like exactly what it was, a building, nothing more, no longer a place he had to hide from or return to, just somewhere he happened to own. 2 steps from the corner that had always been his. He had spent 3 years making sure no one saw him at all. She was the first person who had, and stayed anyway.